The morning fog clung tightly to the streets of San Francisco as Julia Hayes made her way toward the esteemed Westwood Music Academy. Her simple gray cardigan and modest dress stood in stark contrast to the fashion-forward students crowding the sidewalk, their instrument cases emblazoned with elite conservatory logos. Clutched in Julia's hands was a worn leather notebook brimming with her true passion, original musical compositions. At 33, she had carved out a humble career writing arrangements for local orchestras and small-scale productions. Though her music was performed by many, few knew the name or face behind it. And that's how Julia preferred it. "Excuse me," she murmured as she weaved through a lively group of violinists chatting excitedly about today's big event. A visiting masterclass with the notoriously ruthless Constance Wellington, the most feared critic on the West Coast. "Can you believe," she said, "Taylor Fisher's Carnegie performance was technically flawless, but completely soulless?" One student whispered. "His career nearly ended overnight." Julia swallowed hard. She remembered that brutal review. Constance Wellington didn't just critique performances. She dissected them, her words often wielded like weapons. Inside the building, Julia approached the front desk. "I'm here for the Composition and Performance Connection seminar." The receptionist barely looked up. "Room 342. Sign in." As Julia scribbled her name, the woman glanced up at last. "Are you a student or faculty?" "Neither," Julia replied, shifting awkwardly. "I'm a composer. My publisher arranged for me to observe." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Well, it's meant for performance students. But since you're on the list," she handed Julia a visitor badge, her skepticism barely concealed. In the elevator, Julia mentally rehearsed her reasons for being there. Her publisher had been blunt. "Your compositions are technically stunning, Julia. But they lack connection, an understanding of what performers need. You write like someone who's never played an instrument." What he didn't know was that Julia had played intensely. For 15 years, she had poured herself into the violin, practicing until her fingers bled. She had been called gifted, exceptional even. But every time she had to perform in front of others, anxiety took over. After a disastrous Juilliard audition, she locked away her violin and never looked back, choosing instead to create music for others to perform. As the elevator doors opened, Julia heard it, the pure tone of a perfectly tuned E string. Her fingers twitched instinctively, an old reflex. She drew a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. Just observe. Take notes. Stay invisible. But she had no idea how impossible that would soon become. Room 342 was no ordinary classroom. It was Westwood's jewel, a miniature concert hall with tiered seating facing a small stage. Julia slipped through the back, relieved to find empty seats in the last row. She sat, notebook ready, determined to blend into the background. The room buzzed with anticipation. Nearly 60 students, most clutching violins, filled the front rows. Faculty members and a few familiar faces from San Francisco's music scene were scattered throughout the middle section. Julia spotted the concertmaster of the symphony and the conservatory's dean among them. At precisely 10 a.m., silence fell. Constance Wellington entered with unmistakable poise. Her silver bob was immaculately styled, gold-rimmed glasses perched perfectly on her nose. Her designer plaid blazer paired with tailored slacks gave her an air of stern elegance. At 72, she carried the weight of her reputation with effortless command. "Good morning," she said, her voice crisp and cool. "I trust you've all prepared something worthy of my time." The students straightened in their seats. Some visibly swallowed. "For those unfamiliar with my methods," she continued, scanning the room, "I don't believe in coddling talent. The music world is unforgiving. Why should I be any different?" Her eyes narrowed. "Today, I'll call on a few of you to perform. I'll critique honestly. If you can't handle that, the door is right there." No one moved. Julia sank a little lower in her seat. "Let's begin," Constance said, consulting her list. Alexis Chun, a confident young woman in a blue dress, rose with her violin. She played a technically flawless excerpt from a violin concerto. The room applauded politely. Constance tapped her pen against her notebook. "Clean, precise, and entirely forgettable. You play like you're scared of the music, Miss Chun." The girl's smile faded. 2 more students performed. Both received similarly sharp remarks. The air in the room grew tense. Julia kept scribbling in her notebook, uncomfortable but intrigued. Constance was harsh, yes, but she was also astoundingly insightful. Then, during a pause, Constance scanned the room again. Her eyes reached the back, and landed on Julia. "You there," she said, pointing directly at her. "I don't recognize you." Dozens of eyes turned to stare. Julia felt her face flush. "I'm just observing," she replied, her voice barely audible. Constance's eyebrows lifted. "Everyone participates in my masterclass. Come down here." Julia froze. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to stay in the background. But Constance was waiting, and 60 pairs of eyes were watching. "I'm really only here to observe," she said again, this time louder. A few students exchanged glances, clearly surprised that anyone would push back against the infamous Constance Wellington. The critic's lips pressed into a thin line. "Young lady," she said coolly, "I've been leading masterclasses for 40 years. There are no passive observers in my sessions," Constance said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Unless, of course, you believe you have nothing to contribute." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Julia felt the weight of every stare as she slowly rose to her feet, clutching her notebook like a shield. "What's your name?" Constance asked as Julia descended the steps toward the stage. "Julia Hayes." "And what is it you do, Miss Hayes?" The question had an unmistakable edge. "I'm a composer," Julia replied, reaching the front row. "Mainly arrangements." "A composer," Constance repeated, her voice rising theatrically. "How fascinating. Tell me, Miss Hayes, do you play any instruments?" Julia hesitated. "I used to." "Used to," Constance echoed, turning to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a composer who used to play. Tell me, how does one compose without an intimate understanding of the instrument?" She gestured toward a violin case resting on the table. "Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate your former abilities?" A few students smirked knowingly. Julia had seen this strategy before, public humiliation disguised as pedagogy. A tactic used in elite music circles to protect power and diminish perceived outsiders. "I don't perform anymore," she said quietly. "Of course you don't." Constance's smile was thin and cold. "Yet you feel qualified to write music for performers?" With a dramatic flourish, she opened the violin case, revealing a pristine Stradivarius copy. "Indulge us. Play something. Anything. Show us the soul behind your compositions." Julia stared at the instrument. It had been 8 years since she'd last held a violin. 8 years of avoiding precisely this scenario, being forced to perform under cold, watchful eyes. "I'm sure you can manage a simple scale," Constance said, her tone laced with condescension. "Even my beginner students can do that." A tall student in the front chuckled and whispered to his neighbor, just loud enough for Julia to hear, "Maybe she can try Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Constance lifted the violin from its case and extended it toward Julia. "Consider this a learning opportunity, Miss Hayes. To write for an instrument, you must understand its essence." Julia knew what this was. She wasn't being invited to learn, she was being invited to fail. Constance had already judged her, a mediocre composer, a fraud, someone who didn't belong. Still, with trembling hands, Julia accepted the violin. Its weight felt both familiar and terrifying. "The stand is there," Constance gestured. "Unless you prefer to play from memory." More chuckles followed. The implication was clear. Julia couldn't possibly remember anything worth playing by heart. Constance took a seat, notebook in hand, eyes glinting with expectation. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Hayes. A scale, perhaps, or whatever simple piece you remember." Julia lifted the violin to her shoulder, her body instinctively falling into position. Muscle memory took over, despite the years. But everything around her, the silent judgment, the tension, the spotlight, spun like a storm. This was why she'd stopped performing. The anxiety, the fear, the certainty that one wrong note would ruin everything. She could play a scale and retreat, escape with a shred of dignity. Or she could walk away, refuse the game entirely. Or she could show them. Closing her eyes, Julia shut out the room, the whispers, the stares, Constance's smug expression. In the stillness behind her eyelids, she found her breath, her center, and her choice. Time slowed as she stood on the stage, the violin snug against her collarbone. The feel of the instrument sent a flood of memories rushing back. Years of dedication, countless competitions, the pure joy of playing, and the fear that had silenced her. She remembered that moment at Juilliard, the one that broke her. Mid-performance, panic had consumed her. Her fingers froze. The music vanished. The judges' disappointed glances had followed her for years. That was the day she vowed never to perform again. Instead, she poured everything into composing, creating music from the shadows. But now, here she was back in the spotlight. A voice from the past echoed in her mind. Her former teacher. Music isn't about perfection, Julia. It's about truth. Play your truth. Her truth. Not the one Constance Wellington wanted. Not the one the students expected. Not the image of a flustered nobody, flailing through a scale. No, she would show them her. Julia opened her eyes and met Constance's condescending smirk head-on. The critic expected failure. She had set this stage with precision, eager to break the woman who didn't fit her mold. But Julia's fingers moved to the strings, fingers that, despite the years, had never truly forgotten. "We're waiting, Miss Hayes," Constance said coolly, glancing at her watch. "Or perhaps we should move on, if this is proving too difficult for you." Laughter flickered through the front rows again. The concertmaster shifted uneasily, his posture betraying a desire to step in, but he held back. Julia inhaled deeply. She could leave now, slip back into her quiet, safe world, writing music in the background, unseen, untouched. Or she could reclaim what fear had stolen. Not just her ability to perform, but her courage. She made her choice. Julia didn't lift the bow to play a scale. She didn't reach for something easy. She positioned the violin under her chin, poised her bow, and drew out the first note, a rich, resonant G that sliced through the whispers like a blade. Silence fell. Then came another note, and another. The unmistakable beginning of Bach's Chaconne from Partita No. 2, a mountain in the violin world. One of the most emotionally and technically demanding pieces ever written. A piece that separated the practiced from the profound. Across the room, Constance's eyes widened, the smug confidence cracking for the first time. This wasn't a hesitant attempt at redemption. This was an artist arriving. She hadn't expected this. As Julia continued, her notes rang with technical precision, but something more shimmered underneath. Raw emotion, unspoken words, and years of silence finally given voice. The classroom, the stairs, the critics, they faded away. There was only Julia and the violin, speaking after a long, painful silence. She closed her eyes, surrendered to the music, and let it speak for her. Each note of the Chaconne unfolded with aching beauty, shaped not only by flawless technique, but by something deeper: experience, loss, resilience. Julia's interpretation was intimate and vast all at once, each phrase rising and falling like breath. She wasn't just performing. She was remembering, healing, and declaring her truth all at once. The room was spellbound. Her body moved with the instrument, subtle, instinctive. Her left hand danced across the fingerboard with fluid agility, while her right pulled emotion from the strings with every stroke of the bow. Double stops, two notes played in perfect harmony, flowed effortlessly, revealing a mastery that silenced even the harshest skeptics. In the fourth row, the concertmaster of the San Francisco Symphony leaned forward, disbelief written across his face. He had played this very piece the previous season, after months of preparation. Yet here was this quiet, cardigan-clad woman playing it with a clarity and depth that surpassed even his own. Constance Wellington sat frozen. Her notepad lay untouched in her lap. The smugness had vanished, replaced by something foreign on her face: astonishment. The moment of humiliation she had so carefully crafted had unraveled completely. And in its place, something extraordinary was unfolding. As Julia reached the piece's pivotal transition, from minor to major, the mood shifted. The music lifted, as though sunlight had broken through dense clouds. An almost spiritual warmth bloomed in the room. Listeners visibly reacted, some with goosebumps, others wiping away silent tears. Still, Julia remained lost in her world, eyes shut, heart open. Her fingers spoke not just through precision, but through storytelling. She told of fear, failure, and the long road back. This wasn't performance, it was resurrection. The music soared through the room's perfect acoustics, reaching even the furthest corners with breathtaking clarity. In the back, a young student discreetly wiped her cheeks, moved beyond words. Beside her, a stern violin professor shook his head, stunned. As the Chaconne returned to its haunting minor theme, now weighted with all the emotional ground it had traveled, Julia leaned into the final stretch. Her bowing grew more intense, vibrato rich and aching, each note a testament to everything she had survived. She opened her eyes as she reached the final bars, gaze steady, fearless. The timid woman who had taken the stage was gone. In her place stood an artist, whole and unapologetic. The last chord lingered in the air, ringing like a question only she could answer. 3 breaths of silence. Then, a gasp from the back broke the stillness. Applause erupted, first from the concertmaster, who stood clapping with unguarded admiration. The rest followed quickly, rising to their feet in a wave of thunderous ovation. Even those who had once mocked her now stared in stunned awe, hands clapping before their minds had caught up. But Constance Wellington didn't move. She remained seated, her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, the critic was utterly speechless. Julia lowered the violin, her chest rising with each breath, the familiar shape still warm against her skin. She had done it. The familiar weight of the instrument rested gently in her hands, but everything else had changed. Julia didn't need to speak. The music had said it all. For a moment longer, she stood still, bathed in the warmth of the standing ovation, the sound of redemption ringing louder than any insult ever had. She scanned the audience not in search of validation, but in quiet recognition. The students, the professors, even the critic, they had seen her. Not the rumors, not the whispers. Her. In the fourth row, the concertmaster gave her a subtle nod of deep respect, the kind exchanged only between equals. At last, Julia turned and walked off stage, her steps steady, unhurried. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Behind her, the applause continued, no longer just polite, but thunderous, heartfelt, unrelenting. The echo of transformation. Backstage, she found a quiet corner and placed the violin carefully back in its case. Her hands trembled, not with nerves but with release. Years of silence had unraveled in a few short minutes. The weight she'd carried for so long now seemed strangely light. A soft knock on the dressing room door interrupted her thoughts. It creaked open. Constance Wellington stood in the doorway, arms crossed but no longer defensive, more like someone bracing against an unfamiliar wind. "That," she said slowly, "was unexpected." Julia met her gaze without flinching. "You wanted truth. That's what I played." Constance's eyes narrowed slightly, as though trying to dissect what she had just witnessed. But then, to Julia's surprise, the critic gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And then she walked away. No words, no critique, no signature barbed commentary. Just silence. It was, Julia realized, the highest praise she'd ever received. She looked down at her violin and smiled, not with triumph, but with peace. For the first time in years, the music belonged to her again.